This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Hi, it's William B. Davis. I play the smoking man on The X-Files, and you're listening to the X-Cast.
Welcome back, everybody, to the X-Cast. As ever, the truth is in here. I'm your host today, Carl Sweeney, and thank you very much for joining me for this episode, which is all about the Sixth Extinction II, Amor Fati, the second episode of Season 7. And I'm delighted to be joined by none other than Tony Black. Hey, Tony.
Hi, Carl. How are you? It's nice to be on for some Season 7 X-Files action.
Yeah, I'm not bad. It's good to talk to you again. Season 7. I was going to ask you this, actually. We might as well get straight into it then. So, Season 7, generally, is this a good season in your book? Because I think it divides fans to an extent, doesn't it? I think it depends which corners of the fandom you're kind of lurking in. What are your general feelings on this season?
I actually have always liked Season 7 quite a lot, and I recently rewatched the whole season, partly in preparation for talking about some Season 7 episodes, and this one particularly, but because I hadn't really done it for a while, I hadn't done the whole season. There were certain episodes that I've not watched vast amounts of time, things like Chimera, that just, and even Fight Club, it is all right. Yeah, Fight Club is not all right on the flip side of that.
Yeah.
But Chimera's all right. Yeah, so there are some really good episodes, but I've always liked the season as a whole. I think this is a bit more my jam than Season 6, much as I do enjoy Season 6. I think Season 7 has a nicer blend for me of comedy, some weird and strange episodes that almost seem like they don't fit in this kind of era. Things like Signs and Wonders or Thief that are really quite horrible and chilling. And then either the more esoteric kind of strange episodes, things like All Things, which I think is a bit underrated. And then you've got some really interesting, if very, very sparse mythology episodes. I think there's a nice balance to Season 7, and I actually think it's quite underrated generally, because it is the X-Files kind of running in place, sure. It is a bit on autopilot at points, yeah. I grant you that. But it's also just really... I would encourage anyone to watch it and do a run-through like I just have, because it's extremely fun when you're just doing a bit of a binge, I find. So it's a good one. It's a good season.
Yeah, I had the same experience a couple of years ago, whenever the Blu-ray set came out, and it was the first time I'd sort of mainlined Season 7 in a while, because it was never my favourite. It was never one I was madly keen on. I think at the time, I was kind of feeling a bit, I wasn't over the show, but it felt like, the peak had gone, and I actually found Season 8 really rejuvenated my interest, to be honest. And then I watched certain episodes over the years, and then, like I say, getting those Blu-rays and thinking, there's a lot of good stuff here. But it's interesting that you mention All Things, because that's kind of what I meant when I said it depends which aspects of the fandom you're in or you listen to, because I think there are some corners of the fandom that think that's a very good episode. You know what I mean? And they talk about it a lot, and they sort of regard it as a touchstone. So when you say it's underrated, what's the general sense you have of it?
I think what I like about All Things, and in some ways you could say the same about Amor Fati, is that it's unafraid to really go into the kind of almost metaphysical psyche of Scully. And I think in a way, even though there's a lot more mythical kind of stuff going on with this episode we're going to talk about, I think in a way it's the X-Files treading that kind of border between profound and pretentious. I think you could say that about both of these episodes, particularly All Things. But when I watched it again, I thought it was just really well done in trying to give Scully a very grounded episode that fits the kind of process that Scully would be going through. And I wrote a few articles on the Mulder and Scully romance recently, through season 6 through to season 8, and I kind of talked about all things a little bit in there, about how it feels like an important step on Scully's journey to really understanding who she is, not just in relation to the work in the X-Files, but also Mulder as a potential partner, as somebody beyond a friend. And you see even more layerings in than we've had all through season 6 by the end of Amor Fati as well with this. So I think it sort of factors into why I like season 7 as a whole, actually, in this retrospect, because I feel like there is actually a lot more going on with this season in terms of the Mulder and Scully relationship that is intriguing. And I think an episode like All Things manages to tell a very human kind of story with aspects and flickers of the supernatural without being the kind of story that, Mulder would essentially undergo. It's the kind of story you could only do with Scully. And I just think that is one that maybe people have not necessarily seen what they were trying to do in that episode. And I think season 7 has a few like that. I think there are a few episodes that, if you look at them through a certain different light, they're actually a little bit more skilled and nuanced than maybe we gave them credit for. And I definitely would say that about Amor Fati, actually, myself.
Yeah, well, let's come on to that then. I've never found All Things that convincing myself, but that's a separate discussion. We don't want to get too bogged down here. Let's talk about the Sixth Extinction II, Amor Fati, which was, like I say, the second episode of the season. Obviously, it's written by Chris Carter and David Duchovny, directed by Michael Watkins. This was first broadcast on November the 14th, 1999. So, we're at the late 1900s by this point. And this is the episode, of course, in which Scully searches for Mulder after the cigarette-smoking man takes him from the hospital. Meanwhile, Mulder is dreaming of a different, more normal life. So, Tony, I guess a mark out of 10 to kick us off, and general thoughts on this episode. And you can talk a bit about the preceding 2 episodes if you want, because we haven't talked to you yet about the Biogenesis trilogy as a whole. What do you reckon?
This is a solid 9.5 out of 10 for me. I'm going to put that straight out there.
Whoa. No way.
Easy. This is just this is just shy of 10 out of 10 X-File. And I will preface this by saying that I think the Biogenesis trilogy is, when I look back, my favourite mythology story as a trio. It taps every single one of my buttons in terms of the kind of things that I'm interested in, not just in the X-Files, but generally. Whether it's the whole mythology of ancient astronauts, the mythic idea of the Campbellian search for the father and the inward journey and all these kind of things that I really love and I'm really interested in. And I think Amor Fati is a really unusual. I mean, it's a trilogy of 3 halves in a way, because they're almost 3 very different stories. Biogenesis is a little bit more procedural in some aspects in what it does. The Sixth Extinction, again, I think very underrated, is a bit bonkers in what it's trying to do with Scully and the African ship. But I think it's great fun and it's really interesting. And then Amor Fati is almost, in some ways, a completely different story, all about Mulder's quest up to this point, the realisation of where he's going with it. It's a real sort of line in the sand moment for Mulder. And I suppose in some ways the mythology that I think could only have come from David Duchovny's very literate mind in many ways, blended with the kind of things that Chris Carter's always been interested in as well. And I've always found this supremely entertaining and fascinating and quite moving and just really, really skilled. And I love it to bits. It's one of those X-Files episodes that I know all of the words. I was watching it today before we spoke, and I was reciting it as I was going along, just some of the lines. It really is one of those episodes for me, and it's absolutely one of my favourites. This would be in my top 10 X-Files episodes of all time.
Wow. I can't go as high as you. I'm afraid I can only go. I actually do like this episode a lot. I would give this an 8 out of 10. I think this is the best one of the trilogy for me. I actually would consider rating the whole trilogy higher than any individual installment because I feel like although they shouldn't hang together, it's kind of greater than the sum of its parts in a way. I think I can't help but massively admire an episode like this because it's so unique. And it's quite hard in some ways to reconcile, I think, what we see here with where we started in biogenesis. Because in a way, like we'll talk about the last temptation of Mulder, but those sequences feel like almost like an extension of episodes like Dreamland or Arcadia in some ways, as much as they do feel like part of a big mythology multi-parter. But I think the thing is that they work really well. And maybe they shouldn't, because maybe the idea is a bit too arch. Maybe the dialogue is too florid, and I think it's very florid at times. But for me, it does come together quite nicely. I think, even though I think what you do see here, it kind of runs the risk of feeling like quite disparate pieces awkwardly stitched together. Do you know what I mean? But I think the episode is able to link those separate storylines quite effectively through some of the visual and oral approaches that we see here. We'll talk a bit about them, I think, as we go along. But you get some interesting, like, overlapping sound transitions. You get things like the hospital room that goes from day to night within a single shot. You get, like, the quick cuts back and forth between the two Mulders at one point. I think that's quite a shrewd approach. I think the style carries us through it here. And I think what also helps is that a lot of that Scully strand is quite underplayed, isn't it? So we don't go back and forth between this quite meditative dream scenario and a really high-tempo thriller, because what's happening with Scully is not really high-tempo. So it's interesting, isn't it, how it veers around a lot of the expected thriller beats. So I'm thinking about the fact that Foley dies off-screen.
Yeah.
You know, the rescue of Mulder's not really played for suspense, is it, in the way it could have been? That kind of thing.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't do what you think in those kind of aspects. It's got like Krychek undulating underneath, you know, and you only see him obliquely, or you know, you get to the point where Krychek has been shot dead, and you don't see that encounter. You just see the end of that. So it is subverting things. It's got a lot rippling around everything else. But I think what is really good about this is it really does square the focus on Mulder's journey, and Scully's important to that story. But what she's doing in this episode, it's almost contextualizing some of the aspects in the real world around what's happening to Mulder, because the majority of the story actually does take place in Mulder's dream, subconscious, whatever state that he's in, really. And it only really comes out of that at various different points. A lot of it sort of takes place in that space. And I think that shouldn't have worked, really. I think really this episode shouldn't work at all. I think I read that Frank Spotnitz thought this was a big risk, but that David Duchovny insisted on it because he felt like they got to a point where he wanted to explore, as you say, the last temptation of Mulder, and this whole idea in terms of what they'd been building towards throughout the sixth season and beyond and before. So it wasn't really a necessary story. You know, you could have concluded that the biogenesis arc in a different way. You could have had that ship taken back to the States or something, and you could have had a conspiratorial kind of episode, perhaps, or something along those lines. But what this does instead is it really does personalize everything. You know, it brings in the smoking man properly, even though we saw him in the background in biogenesis. It brings back Tina Mulder, who we haven't seen since Demons, I think, in season 4. It really does feel like it gets very much back to the Mulder family mythology and that essence that's been there ever since Anasazi, basically, which is obviously the big tie. You know, in this episode, this trilogy ties back to the Anasazi trilogy. So it's almost like the mythology coming full circle in a way, even if the Syndicate stuff was dealt with in Two Fathers, One Son. In some ways, this is almost the postscript to that, the epilogue to that whole mythology in a way, if you see what I mean. And I think I love it for that. It's a more satisfying way in some respects of ending that whole saga than One Son was, I would say.
The thing is that I don't care that much here about the Mulder the Saviour stuff. So I enjoy the dream sequences and I enjoy the inner journey he goes on. But what it means in the grand scheme of things in the real world of the X-Files is a bit less interesting to me. And I think that the very best X-Files mythology installments do achieve both things, in the sense that something like the Anasazi trilogy, with that, I'm very invested in what's going on with the digital tape, as well as what it all means for Mulder and Scully. To go a bit later, an episode like Closure, I think, is more effective than this is at giving us a big mythology installment that's primarily a spiritual journey. So here, I think you still have a lot of traditional myth arc trimmings that are in the mix and occasionally get in the way. So I do think there are some legitimate criticisms here, and I'll point to them as we go through the episode. But there's some absolutely unique, beautiful stuff too, I think. Just quickly on the Last Temptation comparison, and I won't linger on this because I think the plan is that Kurt North is going to record a bonus episode specifically about this. But yeah, The Last Temptation of Christ, the Nikos Kazantzakis book, and the Martin Scorsese film later on. So basically, the other path scenario here, the alternative life, that's generally seen as being redolent of Last Temptation. So in which Jesus is tempted to get off the cross by Satan and lead a peaceful life with Mary Magdalene, before Judas calls him a traitor and Jesus decides to return to the cross to die. So in broad terms, you've got Mulder as Jesus here, the cigarette smoking man as Satan, Deana as Mary, and Scully as Judas. So what do you reckon, Tony? Have you seen Last Temptation of Christ? Are you familiar with that, with the film particularly?
I actually haven't, no. And this is why I am glad that Kurt and Co are going to do an episode more specifically focused on that, because it is an area that I haven't got a vast amount of knowledge of. Know the basics, but it is a film I've yet to see, and I haven't read the book. So I don't have a massive amount to sort of add in terms of that context, and I look forward to that episode that teaches me a few things. But I definitely think this episode, it kind of does and doesn't, on the one hand, do that, the whole Christ story. I think Duchovny has suggested he wasn't trying to make Mulder into a Christ figure, but an everyman. And I feel like the episode doesn't always, it does seem to want Mulder to be Christ on the one hand, and then on the other, you've got the smoking man saying, you're not Ralph Nader, so it feels like it wants to have its cake and eat it a little bit, and very much tap into this idea that Mulder could be the saviour of the world without this turning into a ridiculous show, because that is probably one of the legitimate criticisms. It might be one of the ones you're thinking of, in that, the X-Files was never about Mulder and Scully being the saviours of the world. They're not Marvel superheroes, and that's where this skirts the line of being just completely ridiculous. And after this, there is nowhere really else to go with it. I mean, it makes sense, and I think it was a good idea for them to go, the smoking man's now dying because it didn't really work. That's much better, because the worst thing you could have had was what ended up happening with William, quite honestly, that he becomes an X-Man. That could have happened to Mulder. And I think the show just avoids that, really, in the long run, which is a good thing. And I think the mythic journey that he goes through here is worth taking that risk in terms of the storytelling.
Yeah, potentially, because like I said, some of that is quite downplayed, and they don't sort of milk it for all that it's worth. So I can sort of buy that. Like I said, The Last Temptation will be doing this bonus ep on, or Kurt will. So leave that there for now. We'll come back to it a bit as we go along, probably. In terms of behind-the-scenes context, there is some interesting stuff here, isn't there? And I'm sure you know all about this, but you have an episode written together by two men who were going through a kind of a tough time in terms of their own relationship. So in August 1999, and like I said, this episode was broadcast in November, David Duchovny filed a lawsuit against Fox, which was about how the X-Files had been sold into syndication. Which, I think Fox had sold it to their own FX network. And I think the lawsuit's kind of saying that Fox had favoured FX over potentially other places that might have wanted to pay more, and that by extension this deprived Duchovny of royalties. Or, the lawsuit accused the network of paying Carter to cover it up, in essence. So apparently their relationship was strained for a time, but they seem to get on very well these days, and whenever they did interviews for the revival and Comic-Con appearances and so on. But it lingered for a while, because the settlement was only reached a few days before Requiem was broadcast. So in the background a lot throughout the season, really. I don't know what there is to say about that, really, but it's just kind of interesting to think about them then collaborating on this, isn't it?
Well, from what I've read, it sounds like they worked relatively independently.
Separately, yeah.
In that Duchovny did his portions of the script while Carter was writing the Sixth Extinction, and then he came in and added what I would assume is the majority of the stuff around the mythic journey. I imagine it's Duchovny writing all of Mulder's interactions with the Smoking Man and all of these characters who pop up, Deep Throat, etc. And then it's Carter who's writing the Scully things and the surrounding Skinner and Krycek bits and bobs. That would be my instinct. So you could almost write them a bit separately because they are in some ways two pieces put together in a way. So maybe that's how they got around it, even though there were tensions involved. Or, or maybe they recognised that they were still collaborators on something they both loved and that they were able to park that aside and actually come together to work on this. But it is strange that they technically collaborated anyway, at the point that their relationship was at its worst. And it's quite unusual, really. You would have thought that Duchovny would have just been phoning it in as much as he possibly could at this point, but he wasn't. He's clearly hugely invested in this as an actor as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe it's that whole thing of how sometimes the best work comes out of the most strained circumstances,
Like rock stars who don't get on with each other in the band, that kind of thing. Yeah. I think there's some weird kind of dissonance in this episode, and I wonder how much is attributed to the fact that, like you say, they supposedly worked on it quite separately. In terms of the script, by the way, I've been passed an early copy of the script for this episode by a shadowy informant. Yeah,
ooh,
it was delivered in a big brown envelope under my door late at night. There are some interesting differences between the original script and what we see on screen here, so I might point out some of those as we go in.
Cool.
Before we do, what about IMDb? Do you want to hazard a guess what this episode has as its rating on IMDb?
Oh, well, I don't know if this is going to be super high, really, to be honest, because I know that Amor Fati has its detractors. So I'm going to say 8.2. Let's have a guess.
Not far off. It's an 8.0.
Okay.
Which puts it equal 10th for the season. So it's tied, actually, with the first Sixth Extinction episode. Which I think is harsh. I think this one is better than the first part. But anyway, and it's tied with Millennium, which also gets an 8.0. So I would have this higher than 10th for the season, I would say. I think it would be in my top probably 6 or so. So, like you say, maybe it has a few detractors here and there. I don't really know. All right, Tony. I think maybe we should take a trip. We should travel the road less travelled, shouldn't we? And take a closer look at Amor Fati. Right, so there's absolutely loads going on, Tony, in this teaser, isn't there? So let's maybe break down... There is.
It's going to take us 45 minutes alone.
It is. Well, firstly, we get Mulder watching the parents and the child on the beach. So what's your general sense of what these dream images mean? Because I've heard different takes on it. Is it a premonition? Is it Mulder's inner child? And I think, Chris Carter has been asked about this, obviously, and has tried to sort of say, well, it's open to interpretation. Those interpretations are valid and interesting, I think, is what he said when that was put to him. But how do you sort of take him in general?
Well, it's funny because I saw somebody trying to argue that it was William. It might have been on the basement group, actually. That it was William guiding, his unborn child that hasn't even been, I imagine, invented by the writers at this point. But I always took it to be that it was some form of his inner child or his subconscious, or because it is, it's that whole thing of where the child says in the Smoking Man's voice, the child is father to the man. That to me might well be the key to this, in that it is almost like the inner child guiding Mulder towards the getting through what he's going through in a way. He says at one point, "You were supposed to help me," and it feels like building the spaceship is Mulder's way of trying to get back to his quest or get back to who he is a little bit. So obviously by the end, once he's reached that equilibrium again, the spaceship is built, whereas all through the episode, it's about building. At first, the spaceship is being destroyed, and he says, "What are you destroying it for?" And he says, "It's your spaceship, you're destroying it." So to me, it's a version of the subconscious self-destruction that is going on in Mulder's mind, and that once he's through that, the spaceship's built. The spaceship is the metaphor, I think, for Mulder's recovered sense of equilibrium. So that's kind of probably where I would sit with it, yeah.
Yeah, I think Carter also said, this was from like some kind of web chat he gave back in the day. He said, I believe that David Duchovny, who co-wrote the episode with me, wanted the image of the child to be open to interpretation. And I think it's clear that they are purposefully ambiguous, isn't it? And the episode even suggests, I think, that Mulder doesn't really know how to interpret them, because he says at one point, I've never seen what he wants me to see.
Yeah.
The interpretation that makes most sense to me is not that they represent William, although I think eagle-eared listeners will have heard me agree with Chris Knowles on the season 6 deep dive we did. I think he suggested that, and I kind of agreed, but before I'd really thought about it.
Oh, was it Chris who said that?
He did say that.
Maybe that's where I heard it. Yeah. Might be that.
So yeah, the interpretation that makes most sense to me is not that they represent William, but that we can kind of use those scenes kind of like an index through. We can kind of map Mulder's attitude towards his journey. I think maybe this is kind of what you're saying. I've also seen Kimon from Eat the Corn seems to be saying something like this. So in this first one, the boy taking his steps, maybe that represents Mulder, who's being steered in a particular direction, and it suggests that he's open to being directed at this point in time. Because later in the episode, we get the idea of Mulder as essentially being childish. It's followed up because Foley tells him that. Foley tells him in the dream he's been childish and so on. So I think we can talk about these dream sequences as they come. But I like that sort of interpretation of them. So yeah, this teaser, right. So then we hear, so when I was talking earlier about the sound transitions, I was talking about like the fact that we're still looking at the beach here. We start to hear the doctor talking about Mulder's temporal lobe activity. So it's a very common technique. It's called a pre-lap, I think, where the sound from the next scene kicks in before the first scene finishes. But it happens a lot in this episode. Like you say, Mrs. Mulder, it's been a long time, isn't it? Demons. I was fairly surprised when I realised that. When I looked it up, I was like, whoa, Demons, that's a good 2 full seasons and a bit.
Yeah, one of which was obviously Vancouver-based, because obviously Rebecca Toolan's Canadian, but Vancouver-based, and the other one LA. And I know there was a lot of carryover with some, like, for instance, like Sheila Larkin doesn't appear after like season 5 until season 8, you know, so a lot of the Vancouver people didn't really go down very much to LA. But that's not the only reason, you know, season 5 was Vancouver and she wasn't in that. So yeah, it's been a while. I mean, a credit to the show for not throwing Tina Mulder in there when they didn't need her. You know, I like that. I like the fact that they only brought her back when they felt like she was relevant to the story. And she is a fascinating character, that woman. Like, wonderfully underwritten, you know, wonderfully mysterious. And you see a little bit of that in this episode, without a shadow of a doubt. And
it's a bit pared down from what was in the script, because I think in this episode we see Scully trying to get in touch with Tina later, don't we? But they actually have a brief conversation in the script, which I don't know whether there was just too much here, which is possible, or whether they shot certain things and they didn't work, or whether they just ended up purposefully downplaying things, which is possible. This is the moment in this scene we get, like I say, it transitions to night in the same shot, which is quite effective, I think. And do you take that as a cue that we're now entering the dream realm?
Yeah.
When it does that. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, definitely. I think it's hard to sort of pass the next scene as being real world, really. Yeah. And I think later on, when Scully finds out that Tina checked him out, my instinct is that when you see her speaking to the smoking man, in that little brilliantly tiny little camera moment where you just see her head and you look, it's lucky that the camera just had enough that wasn't sprayed out to see Tina. But then you see her talking to, and the cigarette, which is brilliant. It's funny in a way, but it's also really clever. And the instinct, obviously, my instinct has always been that the smoking man went to Tina and either told her the truth or lied in order to get Mulder taken off to this Defense Department base. And that Tina was complicit in this. But so I think at that point, when you go into the dream sequence, Mulder is probably already on that bed, I would imagine. Yeah. And he's in that machine or whatever space he's in. Yeah, because when the smoking man first appears, he's quoting a Shakespearean sonnet to begin with. Yeah. Is that all a bit... I mean, do you think it's a bit too florid? Because you could say it's a bit much. What do you think? when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I bet your mummy will still love you.
Yeah.
Well, it's obviously a paraphrase at that point. I'm pretty sure that the ending wasn't Shakespeare. But yeah, it is a bit overblown, but maybe that's intentional. I mean, I feel like the Smoking Man is written here with a playfulness in a way, with that sort of Duchovny playfulness that he's an almost self-knowing awareness that the Smoking Man is such a self-aggrandizer and he's such a Darth Vader kind of figure at this point that he writes him in that mold. It's a different kind of Smoking Man from the more relatively prosaic myth, syndicate guy that you get in some of the earlier episodes when they're written by Carter and Spotnitz, for example. Not that, I mean, Two Fathers and One Son has some great dialogue from the Smoking Man, but it's different. This is him being written very much in that sort of mythic arch-villain kind of mould. So I think, in a way, if this is going through Mulder's, subconscious dream state prism, it's actually not the Smoking Man necessarily speaking to him. It's Mulder's version of the Smoking Man speaking to him. So if you look at it in that context, maybe it makes sense that he is a little bit more overblown and florid in some of this dialogue.
Yeah, no, that's what I actually think. I do think it is florid, but I think the general conceit here provides a reasonable pretext for it. Kind of like how in Milagro, the guy is quite an overblown writer, but I think that kind of makes sense in context too. That kind of thing, And of course, we get the moment when he says, "I am your father." So, that's interesting the way they play with that, because obviously that had been a long-standing source of viewer speculation. And we get that moment which caps off the teaser. And then later in the episode, it appears to be confirmed, doesn't it, by Fowley and Smoking Man in quite a low-key way, because they talk about it quite unambiguously in the real world, don't they? So I kind of like that.
But the way I always thought of that was, because I think what I like about this, and why season 11 frustrates me in no end, when it very much tries to hit the nail on the head with this. But what I like about this is that it's still potentially ambiguous. It could just be that the Smoking Man is saying this. It could just be that he's told Deana that he's his father. And it might not be true. It might actually not be true. It might still be the Smoking Man trying to play this role. And I think Bill Davis said something similar. He said fans didn't believe the revelation because in part of the mystique of it was that everybody had their own idea of what was going on. So by that logic, you could wonder if the Smoking Man is just saying this in order to, or if in that dream Mulder says, the Smoking Man says, "I am your father," which is very Luke. I am your father. It is that whole Campbellian Star Wars idea. Is it Mulder's fear? Is it Mulder's underlying fear that this is the truth? Because he's got all the clues. He knows that Smoking Man and Tina had a bit of an affair. He knows that Bill Mulder wasn't the man he thought he was. Mulder's always still clung on to the idea that it was Bill Mulder's his dad, and that Krycek murdered his dad, and that his dad was a victim of this conspiracy. But maybe that underlying terror is that actually, the Smoking Man is his father, is his biological father. So that could be another way of looking at it. And then in the real world, it could just be that Smoking Man's just saying it to Deana. I mean, I kind of don't want it to be true in a weird way,
How does that track with, and I don't know the answer to this because, there are elements of the mythology which I always struggle to keep track of and so on, but the fact that Smoking Man is willing to have that operation, is it the fact that are they supposed to be genetically compatible, the two of them, and that's why he's a good choice to have the operation? And although you could say that the fact that the operation doesn't work, maybe you can read that into it too. I don't know. Can you make sense of that for me? Because I've read some recaps and things. I can never keep it straight.
Well, I can't remember if there's dialogue in there. I know there's a conversation he has with that doctor guy, the syndicate sort of doctor guy, or the post-syndicate doctor, or Argo, whatever he is. And they're talking about, that this is a ready-made, plague salvation or whatever. But I don't know if there's dialogue in there that says this genetic material is from your son or anything like that.
No, I don't think there is, but I feel like I've read that some people think that's why.
I can understand that.
I don't know.
I can understand the logic completely. It's hard to say. Again, it's a little bit ambiguous. I'm probably reaching here. It probably is a fact, and season 11 essentially does confirm it, doesn't it? Really, but I like the idea of it being a little bit more ambiguous. Really, this whole paternal thing, and that it is through Mulder's prism, because that's seen as a few Mulder anxieties. I mean, the other one I like is where the smoking man, when he's saying, "You're not Prince Hamlet, you're not Christ," when he says, "You come with me now, and the world will forget you." Basically, I really like that because it is trying to position Mulder. Yes, on the one hand, he could be the saviour of mankind, but on the other, he's never going to have a religion follow him. This crusade, that has always been, that Syndicate always feared would happen if he died. Isn't going to happen at this point. Mulder's fear is that wouldn't happen. He's not going to have a Bible written about him. He's not going to have, statues built in his name. He would be forgotten. He is just a forgotten hero, quote unquote, in the classical sense. And I think that's great because it feels like a lot of this dream is part of Mulder processing a lot of the fears he has about where this quest has taken him at this point as well. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting things going on.
Yeah, so I think it's worth noting that the tagline for the episode has changed from "The Truth Is Out There" to Amor Fati, which is a Latin phrase that means love of fate, and it's associated with Nietzsche. It's used to describe an attitude in which you see everything that happens in your life, including suffering and loss, as good or at least necessary. The idea that everything in your life has led you to a certain point. Okay, so when I said earlier that there are some elements of the episode that are a bit less, I guess, impactful for me, I'm thinking of some of the stuff like we get with Scully and Critchgow. Like he sort of, they have a bit of back and forth, don't they? He's talking about Mulder's exposure to the virus 2 years ago, so I think he's talking about Tunguska Terma, isn't he? Critchgow saying if she destroys this, he will destroy her. I don't know, do you find any of that stuff particularly meaningful or compelling?
Well, I suppose not. I mean, credit to John Finn because he's a damn good actor and he can make.
It's good to see him. Yeah.
It is good to see him, and it's a shame that he kind of doesn't have a fat lot to do. Generally, I know he has a bit more in the previous episode that you've talked about, but he's a good actor and he can make fairly. I mean, he has to deliver a fair bit of exposition in this, and it's a little bit sort of laboured at points. And he does it quite well. I suppose the suggestion is that, when he said in the last episode about how his life was ruined after the Red Redux, is that he's sort of become a little bit mercenary in the way he thinks. He's almost flipped. But I mean, I'm sure you talked about this more in the previous episode, but it doesn't really ring true. No, it's a little bit like, well, what exactly are you going to do? Like,
Yeah.
So, but I think he feels a bit necessary in this episode, I suppose, to sort of explain a couple of things that Scully might not really have known without that, So he's functional, I guess.
Functional. Right. I think that's probably a decent word, yeah. And of course he meets an unpleasant end later. What about the Skinner and Krychek stuff then? Because I maybe like that a bit better, I think, because there's all the stuff about Skinner being in a compromised position, going back to the nanobots and that kind of thing from SR819. Do you think it's a bit hamstrung by the very fleeting use of Nicholas Lee in some ways? Like we get, I think it's one shot where you can identify him in this episode, and the rest of the time you see Krychek, you're seeing somebody's arm or the back of somebody's body or whatever. I'm guessing they were just working around his availability. But how do you feel about that?
It's a bit weird, isn't it? I mean, isn't there a deleted scene where you see the nanobots in Skinner? I'm pretty sure I saw. There's a screenshot of something where they cut a more of overt visual of that you saw in SR819 previously, because you don't actually see that. All you see is Krychek run off, and Skinner's just a bit sweating a bit, and he's just you don't see the nanobots or anything like you do later on in season 8, which is a far better. Dead Alive is a far better use of this. But it feels like it's there to remind everyone. Oh yeah, by the way, Skinner's compromised by Krychek. But Krycek has such a, like you say, working around Nicholas Lee, but he has such a non-role in this in a way. It almost feels a bit pointless. It almost feels like, I mean, it was interesting listening to you talk about biogenesis with Darren.
Yeah.
And you get that scene where, obviously, because Skinner's having to essentially give things to Krycek in that episode. And there's that moment where he's looking through the doorway at Mulder and Scully, and it's, and he's in the background.
Yeah.
I've always thought that's really good, actually. I was listening, and you guys weren't sure about it. I was like, no, I've always liked that. Because it is this, it's a bit silly in a way, but it is this suggestion that Skinner's operating on a different level in some ways, and there are things going on that they don't know about. And I liked it in that context, but in this, it's just a little bit like, well, why doesn't Scully make more of this, for one thing? Why doesn't she later on question this? Why doesn't she say to Mulder, by the way, there was this weird bloke with long hair who was in the FBI, and he basically, it's just completely forgotten about. And I just think, well, it surely there should have been, this is Krycek, it's not some random, like this is Alex Krycek, it should have had more of an impact.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, so it's a bit of a shame.
I don't mind it, though, because I think they work around it fairly well, and it's possible that having him more in the mix, in the way we're used to him being in the mix, do you think that might have taken away a bit from the more minimalist approach we have going on elsewhere in the episode? Do you know what I mean? The fact we don't get the big rescue of Mulder in a dramatic way, that kind of thing. The fact that we don't do those things, maybe having Krycek just as this shadowy presence at the edges of the story is quite good, actually.
Maybe they should have just moved all this to the first episode, Sixth Extinction.
Yeah.
Maybe it should have been in the last week's episode. I feel like it might have worked a bit more in there because you've still got the character of Dr. Barnes. You've still got more of the direct African link and that kind of thing. Maybe they should have just moved it. I don't know. It's cool in a way, and I do like the final moment you see Krycek and the burning flat, and that's cool. That's a fleeting moment, but it's well done. So yeah, I suppose that's another way to look at it.
Yeah, because that moment with the fire, because it comes out of the fiery apocalypse, isn't it? Then we cut to Krycek burning the stuff, which is a nice transition, I think.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so there's another dream sequence I wanted to talk about, and I like the way those dream sequences are done with the beach. The very saturated look to the imagery that we get. Yeah. The beach reminds you of the beach we'd seen in Biogenesis and the Sixth Extinction, I think. So the next one is where the boy speaks with the cigarette-smoking man's voice. So this is what I like about it, that if the earlier scene you can read as the boy being kind of a stand-in for Mulder, I think this scene means you can't read it across to the next one quite so easily. But it suggests this kind of overlap between Mulder and the smoking man, doesn't it? And do you know what I mean? I think it ensures that you can't pin like a really easy holistic interpretation on these scenes because what's being symbolized seems to shift around a bit, doesn't it?
And you wonder if that's intentional. I mean, it seems intentional. I mean, why loop that dialogue with William B. Davis's voice? Otherwise, what is the essence of what it's trying to say? And that is a bit oblique, definitely.
It's a nice juxtaposition, isn't it? In fact, the kind of thing is nicely incongruous. The fact that the child suddenly speaking with that voice, I like. What about Albert Hosteen? What about him? Because he pops up a few times here. We've been reintroduced to him in Biogenesis. I think here his role is to sort of tell Scully that she must save Mulder for the sake of us all. And then he appears a bit later on and encourages her to pray. So as nice as it is to see him again, and it is nice to see him and he's a nice actor, they don't feel like the strongest part of the episode to me.
I think there's partly two reasons. I think partly it's to very much directly tie everything back to the Anasazi trilogy, as opposed to just the book and the Native American writing and all that kind of thing on the alien ship. But it's to have that spiritual aspect of the episode, because it's obviously this whole episode is all about that the god aliens kind of mash up in conflict with each other. The whole question of, I think the smoking man, when he's on that bed and he's talking to Diana, says, this is basically a gift from God, that's been given to us.
Yeah.
And then when it fails, interestingly, by Requiem, he's basically telling Rita Covarrubias there is no God. He's become Nietzsche by that point. But it is very much, I think, trying to fuse together in more of a literal sense, I suppose, the metaphysical kind of religious aspect with ancient aliens, with, you know, all of this stuff going on. So, and I think bringing back Albert Hustine, he made such an impression in the Anasazi trilogy as a really interesting, dignified character. And nothing that he here is as good as that. You know, you're never going to get a moment here that's as good as this is where you pucker up and kiss my ass. You know, that scene with Albert. But that was Skinner saying that, by the way, not Albert. That would be funny if Albert.
That would have been a very different scene. Yeah.
It would have been. But so I think that's part of it. But I also think it's in line with some of the stuff that was happening in the last episode and the aspects of the Sixth Extinction, which I love the most, which is Scully's weird moments of seeing things, particularly that African spiritual figure. You know, when she's in the car and he says, "Some truths are not for you," which is reminded me of Fresh Bones, actually.
Yes,
the moment in Fresh Bones.
Same, yes.
Yeah, which is Fresh Bones is played more for terror. Again, Fresh Bones, one of the scariest X-Files episodes ever, one of the underrated episodes of the X-Files ever, by the way. Just it had a similar kind of idea that there are these, it's what Albert says, there are more worlds than the one you can hold in your hand. And I think that's part of what I like about this, in that Scully's going through this sort of netherworld in a way, and she's encountering these spiritual forces that are beyond her understanding or our understanding. It's like at the end she says, "I don't believe it. I don't believe he wasn't there because I saw him. You know, he held my hand." And that's great because in both these episodes we don't know ultimately. They could mean all kinds of things. It could be God. So I like that, and I think that's the reason that Albert's there, definitely.
Yeah, I don't dislike the scenes with him. I just feel they're not as compelling as, for example, the stuff we get with Mulder. So I think some of these things I'm critiquing, I'm not saying they're like abysmal. I think that's part of the reason why I land at a lower score than you, I think. But like I say, I do really like the Mulder stuff. So Smoking Man takes him to that very leafy, idyllic neighborhood. It's a joy, isn't it, to see Deep Throat again for the first time since Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. And actually, I believe the last time we'll ever see him. So it's really good fun to see Jerry Hardin, and it speaks to the sort of father figure theme as well, doesn't it? Yeah,
definitely. Look out for an interview with Jerry Hardin on the show, by the way, everyone. I don't know if that's out yet, but it's coming up if it's not, with Russ Hugo. But yeah, lovely to see him back. Even in one scene, he's like, you remember why. You know, I felt myself missing him just the way Mulder had been at that point. I was like, oh, this guy's so great. Like, it's just such a shame that he wasn't in a vast amount of the show. And it's really nice. And it's so nice to have him positioned as it is a bit like Mulder finding his sort of dad in a way. There is a little element of that, I think. In fact, it's interesting that they chose Deep Throat instead of Bill Mulder, actually, because in theory you could have had Peter Donat come in and do this. Could have been Bill Mulder in that kitchen, in a way. You know, the idea obviously is that the smoking man's his father, but you could have had a scene that he goes there and Bill Mulder says, "It doesn't matter that I was never your real dad. You know, all this, I'm okay, it's all good." But they choose Deep Throat, and I think it's because Deep Throat is more of a iconic character in the history, not just of the show, but of Mulder's entire story. And in the show itself, Deep Throat is a bit legendary to Mulder as a character. So to actually encounter him in this, because it is, this whole stuff, it's a bit like going to heaven, isn't it? It's a bit like Mulder Goes to Heaven, really. You know, and he meets the people he's lost. You know, Deep Throat says, "It's okay, don't worry about Dwayne Barry and Scully's sister, it's fine. It's all right. Everything is okay in the end. We're all in this happy space together." And that's fascinating, really, that Deep Throat is ported in for that specific purpose. It's all about Mulder being reassured that he's reached the end of this quest and that he's okay. He's in this wonderful space where all the people he loves are there, except one, crucially, Scully. And it's a really great use of Deep Throat because it both is, it almost feels like a sequel to his character in the show, in a way, but also it's a logical character beat in this dream world and in Mulder's version of quote unquote heaven for him to be there.
Yeah, I think it works really well because I think Mulder says to him about, I thought that you died for my quest. So it's like Deep Throat is embodying, and he talks about some of those people, doesn't he? He's embodying everybody else who has died for Mulder's quest. So Scully's sister, Dwayne Barry, and so on and so forth. And I think as one of the third, as it's such an iconic, memorable moment at the end of the Erlenmeyer flask when Deep Throat is dispatched, that I think is a really good choice to see him here. And it's just humorous to see him, when he jokes about, I'm not dead, I'm just really relaxed, really good fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, it took me by surprise when I realised it was the last time we saw him. But of course, we don't see him again in The Truth, do we, as one of the ghosts?
No. It's X instead, isn't it, in there?
Yeah.
Which I think fits better, actually, to have X in that role, because it is at a point where Mulder's at his lowest ebb. So for someone like X to come in and, basically chew him out a bit would work it better in that way than if it would been... X would never have worked in this scenario, I don't think.
No. It's hard to imagine him being so cuddly. I mean, Deep Throat was never like that in life, was he?
No.
Works. So there's another scene with a dream on the beach. So it's the boy on the beach making the sandcastle, and just the idea of you can build it again, and I really like that as a representation of sort of the meandering, convoluted nature of Mulder's quest, so the meaning doesn't come from getting to the end. It's about the fact you have to be, it's the repetition of having to pick yourself up after you've been set back and start to build it again. So I like that as an illustration of Mulder being very steadfast. Do you know what I mean? He's generally is someone who won't be deterred, not for too long anyway.
Yeah, because he spends so often like being knocked back, one step forward, two steps back. It's a good metaphor, isn't it, for that, generally?
Very good, yeah. What do you make of Diana Fowley's appearance here in the, that slinky little night dress she wears? When she turns up and she undoes his handcuffs. And they kiss, don't they, when they're going into the act break? I've seen some critics. I think I was looking at Darren's essay about this episode, and he critiques some of the dialogue. He calls it gender essentialist because she comes, and I can't remember exactly what she says, but she's talking about having a home life, having a family life, and so on. And he sort of says, Darren's talking about how maybe it's a bit weird for Mulder to be responding to that, but I feel like you can't fully disentangle that from the visual aspect of this episode and this scene, which is that she fills that nightdress reasonably well, I think.
I'm glad you said that for me. But yeah, I think it, I think it works better than the whole evil take your bra off in biogenesis moment, really. Yeah. Which you guys talked about very well, and I did agree with you in what you were saying there. I think in this case again, I go back to the fact this is not real. This is not reality. This is not really Diana. This is Mulder's, or this dream space's version of Diana. This idea that Mulder has always been aware that, and this is something that season 6, played with, and season 6 suggested that he and Scully do not live a normal life. They're not, by this point, he's nearly 40, the character Mulder. He should be settling down. He should be having children. He should be living in the picket fence house, and that in theory, Diana represents a woman that we know he might have been married to once. We know he was in a relationship with in the past, the old flame who potentially was the one before Scully, if you like, that he maybe thinks in this dream space that and let's face it, she's part of the temptation, isn't she? She is part of the, the snake in the garden. There is a little aspect, and she's played very much along those lines. But I think it is also that sort of weird juxtaposition in Mulder's mind between lover and mother, which is something that, that's very much underwriting a lot of this. We talk about the father stuff, but remember in the teaser, Tina leaves him. She says, I love you, and she goes, and you hear him screaming her name like a little boy, and that's part of the transition into the dream space. Well, I still think that is the dream space at that point. I think it sort of meshes between the two, I think Tina is in that hospital, but then I think by the point that he's screaming Mom, that's not really what's happening, So I think there is this strange sort of juxtaposition, really, of these female figures in his life between mother and lover and sister, obviously with Samantha. And I think it's also jumbled in Mulder's mind. So I think the vision of Deana in that slinky nightgown as the seductress, the woman he then sleeps with, is purposeful, because I think it's making the point that this is what maybe Mulder thinks should be happening in his, only in Mulder's sort of weird dream space would he have a normal relationship with a woman in a house and she's dressed like that. That's very much a Mulder cut. And it's not even a fantasy. It's not a fantasy. It is Mulder's processing of this, I think. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting though. But I can see what Darren might be arguing there. But I think, and others have argued, but I think it makes sense. And I think it's quite well done in that context. And also Kurt North would have loved that scene.
Oh, absolutely. But I think he would have been in mourning after the end of the episode, though, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
I'm not sure how he's going to get through the last temptation of Mulder
I know.
recording, to be honest.
It'd just be him crying, all through, I think.
2 hours. Yeah. I really like Fowley's role here, and in these sequences, because as a real character, I do feel like they never really cracked her. You know what I mean? They never found a great way to utilize her. But I think I've said before, I think she works better as a concept than in actuality. So that's why I think seeing her in the dream sequences like this actually works really, really well, because I think the idea that she's embodying kind of this seductive alternative path, it's credible, but not in a realistic way, if that makes sense. It's kind of in a different realm. And I think she's a good fit for it. Because, they get that whole scene with the morning after, where, when he's like, I slept with you one time, what's it going to be like after this? When he's saying he has to plant his feet in the world, become a father, and so on. Do you think there'd be a bit more novelty to some of this if we hadn't have already seen things like Dreamland and Arcadia? Because we've kind of already gone through the sort of Mulder living or playing at living a normal average Joe life. Do you know what I mean? I mean, they're very different episodes is the thing, isn't it? Like, they're significantly different tonally. So I think that's the main thing. But what do you think?
I agree. I think that's it. I think that the previous instances were Dreamland was, the body swap comedy aspect of it, and him not really knowing how to be in that father sort of husband mold. And then Arcadia was the satirizing of all that. It was the undercover marriage, 1950s kind of satire idea. And also Mulder's, and that episode was all about Mulder's inability to conform, generally to society's norms. This one, the difference here, I think, is that it is part of, as I say, this temptation of Mulder not being on the path that he should be on. By the time you get to the end when Scully is saying, you've got to get up and fight the fight, as if there's a fight still to battle in a way. But that's the thing. That's the interesting thing by the end of this episode, in that there is kind of no fight anymore. And that's, I think, one of the problems people might have with season 7, because the mythology is completely listless. It's not really even there by this point. It's sort of just gone, really. And I think maybe people wanted more of an impetus for Mulder to be out questing, and like in the early seasons where he's battling and he's getting into all and it doesn't do that anymore. The show has left a lot of that behind. And I think this is all about that sort of final temptation, the house, the picket fence, Deana, a family, Deep Throat just down the street, all of this stuff. It's in a different context. It is much more about Mulder's, as I say, processing anxiety, I think, about what he should be doing as opposed to what he is and who he is and what he still thinks there is left to find and to quest. And I think that's why by the end of the episode, once everything's been resolved as such, the current predicament, it's not like the end of Paperclip where you have Mulder and Scully sitting there, resolved that this is the beginning. This is the beginning of their fight. This is like the opposite. The end of Amor Fati is that we're both sort of shattered and damaged and tired, and, we've got each other and we don't know what to believe anymore, and we don't know what has happened, but we've still got each other and we love each other. It's different. And I think that's what this episode does, and that's why I like it so much, because it sort of bookends those two points in those two trilogies.
Even though, kind of like what we said, the stakes here are theoretically at least quite high, aren't they? In the sense that, there's the notion that Mulder's illness is, it kind of is concealing the fact that he's actually going to have this protection from the coming plague. It proves he's become biologically alien and all of that. And like Smoker Man talks about how Mulder has become our savior. I just find whenever I watch the episode, I don't really sort of key into that as much as the internal journey.
Yeah. No, I get that, because it all just feels a little bit like, I suppose it's a bit reactionary. I suppose it's a little bit like, this has all just happened by chance. Like there's no grand plan here. They've just seen an opportunity. Mulder found found that rubbing, and that he suddenly developed this, and this has clicked. And because in Biogenesis, remember, Smokey was sitting there with these people listening as they were going, well, we're all fucked, basically. There's nothing we can do, right? Yeah. They're going to invade, and that's it. We're buggered. Whereas this now, he's found an opportunity that he's taking in order to try and exploit Mulder for this, however true it all is. But it's not quite as dramatic as a colonization plan that's been going on for 50 years with all of these different aspects to it that we saw in the past, and that Mulder having to piece it all together. It's a little bit like, well, okay, let's try and do this. Let's try and save the world. Great. Okay. And then that's what, like I said earlier, that's why I like the fact it doesn't work, because where do you go? Where do you go after this? But I agree what you mean. I think it is a little bit like, it's almost a little bit out of nowhere, I suppose. And you've really, really got to know your lore when it comes to connecting this back to Tunguska and the black oil and all that kind of stuff, which it sort of tries to do. Yeah. And you're a bit like, that's a deep dive here. So yeah, I get what you mean.
Yeah. I'll tell you a moment I love though, because it's when, Mulder and Foley go over to the Smoky Man's house. He appears looking very dapper with the tie and all that.
Yeah.
I like the introduction of Samantha, the idea that she's been living here all along, and they hug. And then we cut very abruptly to Mulder on the operating table at that point, don't we? And that's when they talk about how, I'm sure he dreams, and Smoky Man gives this little homily about, extraordinary men are tempted by the most ordinary things. I just love the cruelty of it, about cutting to that moment. I mean, it's pretty obvious all the way through, I think, that this is not something that's literally happening. But that's the moment that we cut back to Mulder on the operating table, and it's just after he reconciles with his sister. There is a little bit more Samantha in the script that I've seen that I was talking about, where they have a bit of a conversation, which is a bit more like, what they talk about in Redux 2. But I like the way it's presented in the finished episode.
I love how that's seeded in Biogenesis as well, because you get the mention of Samantha, in that she's the one thing left. She's the only thing left for him to do now, really, to still find her. And so you get to this, and what I like about the dream idea, this heavenly almost, post-quest life, is that in theory it's reasonable. In theory, maybe Samantha could have been just like sequestered away as part of, she was experimented on. She had a whole new life. She maybe had a new name. It was almost like witness protection in a way. In theory, that could have happened. So it's not in a way too illogical. The deep throat stuff is, I suppose.
Yeah.
But Samantha, not necessarily. So it kind of it works. It works in that Mulder is getting everything he wants, basically. And it's all happening in exactly the same place. But I like the fact we don't get more with Samantha, because she doesn't represent a character as such. She represents, if we're looking at it from that Campbellian myth arc as such, she represents the treasure in a way at the end of the quest. She represents something a little bit more than a person in this context. And I think the episode recognises that in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, like I say, I really like it. But I've mentioned the operating table, which is worth following up on. So it's like the crucifix-shaped table, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mulder's wearing the thing that's kind of across his head, which you can kind of see as like a crown of thorns. And this is where they talk about how he might not survive, he might suffer a hero's fate, and so on. So I saw this quote from Duchovny from an interview with Cinefantastique magazine, and this may be what you have seen that you were talking about earlier, but it's where he says, that's what makes Christ so heartbreaking in that movie and in that book, so referring to The Last Temptation of Christ. He says, his struggle is not only godlike, but also profoundly human. People ask, when is Mulder going to get a personal life? Well, this is the equation. This is what it's all about. Mulder is a guy who's been given the same problem. You either have a life or you sacrifice it all, and you become this guy who's running around chasing aliens and has no life. I wasn't saying Mulder is Christ. I'm not inflating Mulder. What I'm doing is using the very human model of Christ to make Mulder an everyman. How do we reconcile that? Because the episode, and this is mainly in the real world storyline, but it is positioning Mulder as this kind of divine savior figure, isn't it? Where he's like part alien, part human. And there's a lot of dialogue that encourages us to read Mulder as an archetypal hero, as well as the stuff Smoking Man's talking about, like I said, where it's like extraordinary men are always tempted by ordinary things. And also the flourishes, like at the operating table, the thing on Mulder's head, that really, do encourage you to read him as a Christ-like figure. So, I don't know, it seems quite hard to me to square that with what he's saying there. What the company's saying there? What do you think?
Yeah. As well, the idea that when Scully finds that, when she's given that book, and it talks about a myth of a man who can save us from, apocalypse, extinction, that goes back to ancient Navajo myths and all this kind of thing, which, would be, in some senses, it's an equivalent sort of prophecy to Christ, to the Son of God, to this, these biblical ideas of the second coming, resurrection, this kind of stuff, that you see in all of these ancient mythologies. And that obviously ties into the idea of the ancient astronauts, doesn't it? And this whole, uniform sort of idea of the same story repeated in all these different cultures. So it is trying to suggest that there is, and then obviously Providence and Provenance gets even more into this wacky prophecy stuff, with Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia / Fox Mulder, later on, which is daft. But yeah, it kind of like I said earlier, I think it just wants to have its cake and eat it. I think it likes the idea of the Christ symbology for Mulder, but at the same time, Duchovny's trying to subvert and satirize it in a way. But I think the episode is a little bit too in love with the idea of this, of Mulder being that Christ allegory. And that maybe is where a lot of people get off the bus with this one. And I can understand that completely. I can understand that because he isn't supposed to be that kind of character. But I think but again, I say again, the fact that this is all for nothing is what makes it worth it for me, and that it's never really about the fact that he can save the world, because in the X-Files, the world isn't going to be saved. The only way we're not going to be all destroyed is like how we find out in My Struggle 4 or 3 or whatever, that the aliens just can't be arsed anymore. That's the only way we're going to be saved. Yeah. Otherwise we're doomed. Yeah. And that's the whole thing going through this. I think I like the idea that this is much more about Mulder through this whole framework, reconciling who he is and where he is at this point in his life. And that then season 7 definitely, if you watch that series, it definitely then picks up on that. After this, he is a bit of a different character in a way. And I think in what he ends up, by the time we get to Requiem, what he recognises is best for him and for Scully is different than it would have been at the end of, even maybe at the end of season 6, but definitely at the end of Fight the Future. And I think this is all part of that journey for him, and I think that's where it works.
Yeah, I just can't quite shake the feeling I was talking about earlier, that there's some kind of strange dissonance at play here, and I'm wondering if this is where the fact that it's believed that Carter and Duchovny worked on the episode quite separately comes into play,
Yeah.
Because you have what's happening in the real world, in some ways appears to be undercutting what Duchovny's talking about in terms of his interpretation of it. So I'm wondering if that process of creation is what is quite a strange process between the two of them. I'm wondering if that's what's happening here, because you have quite distinct sections.
Yeah, and it could be part of that tricky balance, that the risk that Spotnitz was talking about, that maybe you wouldn't be able to offset these two. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah, maybe. What do you think about? Do you think we get sufficient preparation here for like Diana Fowley's about turn as a character? Because we get them talking, Scully and Fowley in the corridor, there's actually a bit of cut dialogue from the script, which was funny. I think unintentionally funny, perhaps.
Right.
Or at least not really suitable, where Scully tries to appeal to her and says, like, there must be something more to you than, like, cleavage and ambition. And then Diana Fowley says, you got a big mouth for a little chick or something like that. And it just doesn't really seem
That's
a good
weird.
fit from Fowley, especially. Yeah. But anyway, we get that scene where, you know, Scully's telling her to think about the Mulder she first met and so on. I like that Fowley's change of heart isn't really milked for angst, though. I mean, you know, she does say to the smoking man it would have been nice to give Mulder a choice. And then we do get a couple of indications that she's uneasy with what's going on with Mulder. But we never get, like, a screaming match between her and the smoking man. You know, she passes the key card to Scully anonymously. You know, we don't hear a big monologue about why she's done it or anything like that. And the main thing, of course, is that we don't see a big dramatic death scene. So I do think some of it's a bit underpowered, but I do like some of that restraint too, in a weird sort of way.
I like the restraint of her dying off screen because it leaves you to wonder what happened there. There's a lot. It's like, you know, we don't even find out how she was murdered. We just said she was murdered. Was she shot? Was she strangled? You know, how was it done? Where was it done? You know, and we know why, because she gives the key card to Scully ultimately, and the book and these kind of things. And obviously they knew about that. They found that out. But no, so I like that aspect. But I think the problem with Diana is that she's too interior as a character, in that you don't really ever know her true motivations. We know that she's got the long-held dynamic with the smoking man, which could be sexual. We just don't know. There's a hint of that, which is weird and creepy. But we never know enough about her. We never know enough about what she's thinking. And that is part of the mystery, obviously. And I get why. But I think if we knew a little bit more about, and actually know a little bit more about her history with Mulder, because that was maybe too mysterious in the end, we might have more of a sense as to why, in the end, she would essentially get herself killed, because she would have known that was going to happen. The moment she gives these things to Scully, she knows she's dead. And she dies to save Mulder, ultimately. You know? So, if you want to look at it from those terms. But it is a little bit too oblique, I think, for it to really land and make sense for her as a character. That scene, though, is worth it with Scully, because you get the excellent moment where she goes, "Let's cut the crap, shall we?" And Scully's brilliant. Yes, let's. Which is I love that. I love the way that Gillian Anderson plays that moment. It's really good.
And I wonder if we had seen all the things I sort of mentioned there, if we had, you know, have had Diana give this very upfront statement about why she's doing what she's doing in terms of wanting to save Mulder, I wonder if that might not have landed either, in terms of, I'm not sure they prepared the ground for it. You know, I don't think she was ever used particularly well in the earlier episodes, so it would have been hard to, like, really get some genuine feeling out of that, I think.
Yeah.
I do love the stuff with, you know, the Mulder-Fowley relationship in the alternate, the dream timeline, where, you know, we go from the wedding day and they've got kids.
Yeah.
And, you know, Mulder's getting older, Diana's dead. The smoking man is great there because he's not aging at all. And so I love the feel of all that stuff, you know. I think it's great. And the way it's cut together is really good, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And Mark Snow's music is fantastic throughout this episode, I think. I mean, he's always really good, but there's a real creepy hauntingness. My favourite scene for both his music and I think in general is the scene with old Mulder in the bed and Smoking Man, which is fantastically strange and uncanny. It's unerring, and it is. I love the lyricism of that and the sadness and the horror of it. Really, not just when he opens the curtains and it's the apocalypse, but before that, when, you know, he's Smoking Man's telling him everyone he loves is dead. And his reaction, like, Scully's dead? And he's like, she's dead.
And he's like, we've been through this. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's brilliant.
Yeah, really
it's brilliant because it is very much, it's the whole cycle of life that he's gone through in such a short space of time. It's almost a classic science fiction trope that you see played out in all kinds of franchises. So like the episodes of Star Trek where they, you know, a character has to live an entire 100 years of their life in 1 hour, and then they end up back where they were, and they're just a mess. But in this case, it's very much about Mulder. At the end, he says, "We're the last, you and I," and it's horrible. It's chilling stuff. But I think it's so well put together.
Yeah, and that image that they end on there, where Smoking Man's looking out the window at this post-apocalyptic landscape, and like all the buildings are burned and the UFOs are flying around. That's very evocative, actually, isn't it? I like the way they do that, and it's the closest we'll ever get to seeing, what could have happened in like the 2012 type scenario. You know what I mean? We never quite go to something like that again, do we? I can't think of anything else that's comparable.
No, and I remember that really captivating me as a teenager. That whole sequence, I remember being a bit jaw dropped by the fact they'd done that. Because it does very much. I mean, you even get the alien spacecraft right. It's even the same kind of spacecraft that's in Africa that you see at various points through the show. It's that triangular craft. There's a level of detail there in mythology terms which I appreciate. But I just think it has always been that classic thing with the X-Files that if you did do the end of the world, what happened? What you can't do the show after that. The show's gone. You can't really ever put them in that point. Unless it becomes a completely different series. So to actually be able to have that moment where you see that and the horror of the apocalypse, of the invasion, it's fantastic. And it's so clever the way they managed to just get that in as part of Mulder's fear of what would happen if he gives up this quest and the world ends,
And also, before that, before we get that moment and a little bit earlier, but you get another of those beach scenes. And it's the one where the boy has made the UFO and starts to destroy it, And I really love that as well, as a representation of Mulder's capacity to get in his own way, if that makes sense.
The
idea that he actually has to proactively embrace his role as the hero with a quest that he's got to undertake. If he doesn't, he will be, figuratively speaking, destroying his own spaceship in the sand. Do you know what I mean? So I love that too.
Yeah, that's a great bit of allegory. Definitely for that. Yeah.
Love that. And then, so we get into the business end of stuff then, because it's Scully coming to rescue Mulder, because she's got the key card and all of that. And then in the sort of alternative path scenario, she comes in and she's really like stern with him, isn't she? Which is nice. Like she calls him a traitor and a coward. He's been lulled to sleep. Get up and fight the fight. I really like that as a call to arms. And then I really like in the real world that you have Scully finding Mulder, telling him he's got to wake up. And I think it's that scene where you get the cuts between Mulder on the operating table and then the old Mulder back and forth, which is quite unnerving.
Scary. It's really unnerving. Yeah. It's really strange and abstract. Yeah, I love it.
I love that. And then Scully tears up as well, doesn't she? And a tear drops on Mulder and that seems to wake him up. So I love all that. And it's interesting that we don't, get much drama in terms of she gets into the building pretty easily with that key card, it seems. Yeah. She gets to Mulder pretty easily. She gets out, it seems, without significant hassle. But I love the feel of the two Scully-Mulder scenes there.
Yeah. Well, I'm guessing it's that by the time... It's like that, like we see in Enemy later. By the time she gets there, that's all gone. Like, everyone's gone. She's probably just the doors open and there's no trace of anything that could be Department of Defense or whatever. And it's just been cleaned. So it's probably just... I always thought, though... What was the plan for Mulder? Like, were they just going to let you die in there? Like, what were they thinking? What was their thinking process? Oh, he'll be all right. He'll wake up in a bit. He'll be fine. He'll find his own way out. I don't know. It's very strange, but it is a really good couple of scenes. The way it intercuts, the way that Scully ends up being the one who is still alive, and he's saying he's taking care of me. It's fine, and she's like, no. She represents, I think, that inner strength, that resilience you talked about, that he has to keep going, and that she ends up being, and it's like he says in that final scene, you were the one who told me the truth. You were the one who kept me going. You didn't lie to me. You didn't make me believe, trade my mission for creature comforts, which is what Scully says, doesn't she, in that? Yeah. She's the one who pulls him back into reality, basically. And that's great, because even there, deep down in the back of his mind, and that's what's interesting, in that you never see Scully before that moment. She's not in any of those dream sequences. And I suppose the episode structure would have been different, wouldn't it, had we seen Scully in there? Because people might have gone, well, who's the Scully then in the other stuff? Like, what's happening? Like, is she it might have confused people. That might have been the choice, but I think it works as well in that it's almost like Mulder's been willed to sort of forget her.
Yeah.
He's been led down this path by these people who aren't in, like she says, lulling him to sleep. And then it takes Scully coming in to wake him up. And I think that's great.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it works better as an alternative path if she's not there, doesn't it? Probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also love that scene at the doorway between the two of them that ends the episode. Because we get some of the plot kind of stuff delivered to us. The fact that Hostine is dead. Scully gets emotional and says it's impossible. The fact that Diana Fowley has been murdered, she tells him. And then they have that lovely exchange, don't they? Yeah, the stuff about you and my constant, my touchdown is really good. But also the way Mulder, at times in that scene, he's speaking in this kind of intimate sort of whisper, isn't he?
Yeah.
And again, just a nice restrained elegance to it. The kiss on the forehead. I think she touches his lips with her thumbs at one point. So I do think that's an excellent scene. I think it's a really, really great scene. One of the highlights of the episode.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in the whole debate of, Shipper versus no Romo, that scene is where I probably sit, really. I think that kind of approach to this is where I think the show is perfectly pitched, in that they clearly love each other. They're clearly in love with each other in many ways. There's the whole, I think, does she sort of she brushes his lips, doesn't she? Yeah.
Yeah.
With her finger. Yeah. The suggestion of intimacy without it being too full on, or being too much specific relationship kind of, mad about you. It's like we get in the eighth season. Like I'm stuck in an episode of Mad About You. This is where I think it works really nice to sort of bridge that gap, because they are edging toward, in this scene is a real marker again, along the lines of, the kissing triangle or the kissing millennium. This is as important because it is a marker point for them in that they have each other. They know that they are each other's rock, and that the way they are with each other here, the kiss she gives him on the forehead, it's more than just a friendship. Yeah. There is genuine love. And not just platonic love either. There's more there, but it's not too... They can still go out and do the partner at work thing at the same time. And so I think it's great. I think it's beautifully written. It's very well performed.
Yes.
And it's a lovely way to end the episode. A reaffirmation of their bond, like I said, as opposed to a reaffirmation of the quest, because the quest is over. And this season really is about Mulder coming to terms with all the reasons it's over. Samantha, Enclosure, Requiem, all of these things that happen that are closing the book in a way. And this is the first part of that, I think.
So in the script I've seen, and it's an earlier version of the script, not the final one, but it plays out differently, that scene, because first of all, it's in the FBI office, not in the doorway. And we don't get the you are my constant stuff. The last block of dialogue from Scully is about Diana Fowley being killed. Whereas it comes earlier in the scene we ultimately see. So I love the changes, and I think actually relocating it to the doorway is a nice thing to do, because a doorway is kind of like a transitory point between two positions, isn't it? So it does feel like their relationship is in this kind of liminal state at this point that still hasn't quite crossed the threshold, like you were kind of saying. And now obviously that's going to come fairly soon in the grand scheme of things, isn't it? And some of the markers on that journey will be the Millennium Kiss, and then I think maybe more significantly, all things later in the season. So I like that scene as an indication of what's to come in some ways, or the sort of state they're at now, let's say. But that's not the actual end. The actual end is Mulder closes his eyes, doesn't he? And he's back on the beach building the sandcastle again with the boy. So kind of a signifier of the quest is renewed, but not quite completed. I think it's interesting that the spaceship that they're building, if you look at the top right corner of it, it's not quite complete, It's mostly done, but not quite. So I like that sense of the contentment he has at that moment seems to come from that act we were talking about, that act of trying to make progress towards a goal. And also the sense it kind of evokes the final shot of Biogenesis, doesn't it? The overhead look at it.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, I'd thought of that. Yeah, that's really true.
Would you have preferred this? In the script I've been talking about, there's a scene where Mulder sees the dream boy in the FBI building, I think on an elevator or something, and the boy waves to him. So it ends on that kind of weird note. It feels a bit like Nurse Owens in One Breath to me.
Yeah, this is better. This is better because it's more consistent. You know, it's consistent with this idea of it being a subconscious, you know, act of repair, as opposed to the boy is literally an angel or God or, you know, the nurse. The Nurse Owens thing was brilliant in One Breath because it made sense, you know, in a way at that point. Yeah. So for him to sort of cross into that real world and sort of, no, it wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked. This is far more evocative and beautifully done, I think.
All right, Tony. Is there anything else you want to say before we get to the mailbag? What do you reckon? Any final thoughts?
I don't know. I think we've covered this in good depth. So let's hear what other people have to say then. Yeah, I'm very curious.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's head into the mailbag. Okay, so let's have a look. So first of all, Pamela Stafford said, I loved this three-parter. I think both Gillian and David's acting was incredible. My disappointment is not so much in the episodes as in the series' decision to let these pieces of the myth arc drop. Could Scully's ability to become pregnant be tied to the discovery of the ship instead of the cigarette-smoking man? This would still have allowed William to have powers and to be thought of as the hybrid everyone wanted to see, but would have been more accepted than the medical rape. In Founder's Mutation, when Mulder is hearing noises, why isn't that connected back to his hearing thoughts? Why isn't Mulder connected to the visions of William? Great storylines. Fred's ignored is the thing I find troubling. I don't know. What do you make to that? I do like the theory of the ship being responsible for restoring Scully's fertility. I think that makes a lot of sense given what we see. I know Chris Knowles has talked about this, but you see the fishes brought back to life, don't you? So I like that as a fan theory. What do you reckon?
That's very good. Yeah, I was nodding a lot when I heard that. Yeah, I was like, yes, that makes a lot of sense. I think that the whole thing though that Pamela's saying is I completely get where she's coming from because they don't connect up, but I think they're never going to connect up in this show because I don't think that's how they think. You know, I don't think that's how they plot this and how they think in terms of this mythology. And I think that is kind of one of the joys of the X-Files though, ultimately, in that it doesn't always quite add up. And I think the most intriguing mythologies out there always don't add up, you know, in some way. But then they make a thematic or a contextual sense. And I think the X-Files mythology always did. It might not all necessarily... And I feel the same about Lost. They might not always make sense, but I understand them, you know, if you see what I mean. And I think that's the case with this, really.
And it would be quite hard with Founder's Mutation, wouldn't it? You know, for them to then connect it back to these episodes when they've got to think about casual fans who haven't tuned in for like God knows how many years. You know what I mean? They've got to sort of think that way too, I suppose. Okay, so Rene Lariviere says a classic, and just like any classic, we never get much closure or continuation from this trilogy. I would have loved to have seen some throwbacks in later episodes or tie-ins. Missed opportunities and art that Chris Carter and team has mastered. The cinematography, the directing by all three different directors, the acting is always superb. Too bad they killed off Diana when they could have done so much more with her character instead of being a thorn in the shipper's side. The good news is along with her death comes the death of #jealous Scully. And another person who used the hashtag in his message was Christopher Pilbeam, who says, I didn't hate it and I don't like to be negative because there were some great moments, e.g. Diana Fowley is gone at last, and the overall vibe is new and interesting, but I'm not a fan of the Mulder Dreamworld sequences. Always said that Krychek gets barely any screen time, and if I'm honest, I don't really understand the mythology here. Oh, and Mulder's I know Krychek is blackmailing Skinner moment was a waste of what could have been a very cool reveal. Hashtag sad Krychek fan is sad. So, I don't know, what do you make from what those guys are saying?
I would say, like, again, you know, for Christopher's thing about Krychek, you know, Dead Alive makes all this better later on. You know, that does all this very well. So, and in terms of the Diana stuff, I think, well, firstly, that's two people now who wish Diana hadn't been killed, Renee and Kurt.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think what else could you have done with her? Like at this point, like what else could you have done? You would have just ended up repeating the same thing over and over again, really. And I think, yes, you didn't have to have killed her here, but I just don't really see what point she would have served anymore.
Yeah.
They'd done what they needed to do with Diana. You know, she fulfilled a function. In many ways, the function that she fulfills in Amor Fati is the entire point of Diana, I think, in a way. More than anything we've seen before. So for me, it was fine, really, because you're never ever going to get a character who fills this challenger for Scully's affections for Mulder, who's ever fully sits right.
No.
You know, she wasn't the first, Foley, you know, and none of them really worked. So I think she fulfilled her function. Let's put it that way.
You're talking about like the Phoebe Green type characters, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
People like that. Yeah, you know. Or then the jokey ones, like I suppose Bambi works in that sense, but like Detective White, you know, it's So Foley is just the ultimate version of that, really. But yeah, it was enough by this point.
Yeah. Okay, let's do a couple more. So Liam Shane Coughlin says, there's a lot to be said about a trilogy that can arguably be only told at this point in the series' history. Freed from the arcane fringe ephemera of the Syndicate backstory, the mythology of the show becomes wonderfully more opaque and iconographical in a way that it arguably hasn't been since One Breath. I feel like some of these messages are just designed to make me struggle to read them out, you know. No, just kidding. He says, this is a program that knows it's on the deceleration to what it believes is its finale. Careful retooling of the show reiterates the characters as more in control of their own destiny, now the shadowy puppet masters have been moved off the chessboard. Careful interweaving of religious and cultural themes creates a piece that is universal in its desire to ask fundamental questions about the human race, our place in the universe, and what indeed makes us human. Chris Carter indulging his own caprices and allowing a thread of elliptical questioning to enter the mythology, plus one of David Duchovny's finest performances in Amor Fati, a rich and rewarding bag. He's got a good point, hasn't he, about this can only be told at this point in the series' history. It's hard to place this earlier, certainly, isn't it? No, to imagine it being done earlier.
Yeah, it is a thematic sequel to Anasazi, you know, and I think it comes at the right point for the show. Like before this point, I don't see how it could have fitted. I think Liam's right. It was a very good comment. I think he's right about the fact that it does take the mythology to a different place. This trilogy, and it is for me the most interesting place it goes. I think outside of the classic sort of syndicate idea, the classic ideas that the X-Files was built on, which the show has moved away from now in many ways, and never really goes back to in the same way. You know, by the time you get to 8 and 9, the mythology is a different kind of mythology,
very different,
a very very different, and it's not the same as the first one either. You know, it's not the same. And even seasons 10 and 11, it's also different. It's in a different paradigm. So I really appreciate what these episodes do.
Yeah.
And the fact that the show doesn't keep doing them either. You know, yes, okay, you get Providence and Providence, which are lesser returns, and I appreciate that. But they don't. It's not now that every other mythology episode is ancient aliens. You know, it doesn't. This is mainly it. You know, with a few hints and suggestions towards it earlier on in the series run, you know. But yeah, it's a great 3-parter. So I think I agree with his comment.
Yeah, and I agree with him that it's a rich and rewarding experience too. I think that's a nice way to frame it. So yeah, good stuff. And then finally, just a couple more to round off. So Andrew Levitt says, Biogenesis is a thrilling rebuilding of the mythology, bringing back past elements and working them into a genuinely intriguing concept of alien genesis. The Sixth Extinction is an interesting exploration of the religious implications of this potential alien genesis, while showing Mulder's psychic alien powers at work amidst a conspiracy to keep him from them. Amor Fati is a different yet engaging exploration of Mulder's character, if he let go of his pursuit of the truth, perhaps foreshadowing the path of the 7th season. My major concern with the episode is that it leaves so much unsaid, unexplored, and unresolved. Had it played out throughout the season, it might not be so bad, but it doesn't, making elements like Fowley's death and CSM and Mulder's surgery feel like truncated plot points that were never fully developed. As a whole, I love this trilogy. With perhaps the exception of mid to late season 8, this is the last big hurrah for the mythology. This storyline sets the stage for a big new mythology. It's sad it wasn't explored in more depth during season 7, which really needed something bombastic like this. I don't know, because I really do like Sane Zeit and Closure and Requiem. I actually think there's a lot of interesting stuff in Honor Me as well. So I'm not sure I'd quite go along with this is the last big hurrah for the mythology until you get to mid to late season 8, but it's very different stuff, and I wouldn't trade that in. Do you know what I mean? I love the uniqueness of those episodes I mentioned, particularly something like Zane and Zeit Closure. And I know they're divisive episodes, but I think they have such an emotional power that I really wouldn't want to lose them.
And they are really good. I mean, I hadn't watched them for a long time until recently. And I was struck by how good they are. Very good. Yeah, they are. And I think I don't have a problem with season 7 not having much in the way of mythology, really, because I think there is actually some, whether it's just happenstance or chance, I will never know. But for me, there is some intention behind that, actually. And I can see it now. And I can see it a little bit more in that it focuses on slightly different things. So, yeah, I don't really feel we would have needed lots more on this. Because, again, I don't know how much more there is to say, really, about this stuff. You know? This 3-parter kind of just blows open the whole thing, you know? And that's why when you get Providence, it's a little bit of a shrug. It's like, well, we've been here before, haven't we? Like, what is there to say? Like, so... Yeah, I probably won't be on those ones, to be honest, when we get there. Somebody else could do them.
Let's finish off then with Luke Winch, who says, esotericism, panspermia, ancient aliens, Mulder transcending human thought and perception, transmorphic religious and scientific idealism, Scully facing a crisis of faith and belief against overwhelming evidence. This trilogy should collapse under the weight of all these ideas in the kitchen sink, but relinquished from the baggage of the previous 6 years of myth arc, this trilogy feels fresh and invigorating for the mythology. It's also completely bonkers, which is why, after the Anasazi trilogy, of course, it's my favourite multi-episode myth arc. So I think a very nice note to end on, Tony. And I think we've chewed this one over pretty thoroughly. So why don't you tell us what you're up to online? Where can we find you, what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, mainly check me out. I'm quite heavily on Twitter. You can check me out there at AJ Black Writer. And you can find, obviously, me around the We Made This network, WNT_network, and you find all the other shows on there. And I do have a website. Well, you know, I've changed it again because I keep doing this. But now I've borrowed a little bit from this show because my website is called www.thetruthisinhere.co.uk because, you know, why not? And it's all got lots of episode reviews, various links to the books I've written. Indeed, if you want to read a little bit more about the some of the stuff in Amor Fati, check out my book Myth Building in Modern Media, because I do dedicate a section to Mulder's what I call mono-myth arc. So you'll read lots more about this in there if you are so inclined to buy it. So yeah, that's basically where I am and what I'm doing.
Good stuff. Cheers, Tony. Look forward to catching up with you later in the season, hopefully.
Yeah.
I can be found on Twitter at CKJ Sweeney. You can also find my other podcast there, The Movie Palace, at Movie Palace Pod on Twitter, which I've just got off the ground again after a bit of a hiatus. So nothing to do with the X-Files, but you will hear some X-Cast alumni on there. So I think the first episode I did this year was on The Sound of Music with Sarah Blair and Marlene Stemme. I've just recorded one with Tony on Dr. No, for instance.
Yeah.
So some familiar voices over on The Movie Palace. Hope to see you there. You can find the X-Cast, of course, on Twitter at the X_cast. You can find us all in the basement on Facebook. We're also on Instagram as well. But that's all for today, listeners. So always remember, until next time, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Real Talk, the We Made This movie show.
I watched Rabid Grannies on YouTube for free, and it's got hundreds of thousands of watches. And these are things that they've already made their profit from. So these old films, the Troma just stuck them all up and made some extra money off them, and bravo, because they weren't making money from these extortionate eBay sales, but they made money from the free views on YouTube. So I think that's ace. I think bringing those ludicrous films to a new generation, or indeed an old generation who don't want to pay insane amounts, is nothing but a positive thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I didn't know about that.
We dig music.
I need to be very careful this month who I slag off. In the 1968 episode, I slagged off Nick Kamen, and he died.
Did you f***ing kill him?
Yes, I killed Nick Kamen.
Did you kill him with your thirst? Just imagining him in that advert? Your weird, thirsty thoughts just finally did for him.
You do realise, Tracy, I've just recorded your confession and I will be sending it to the authorities. Yeah, try not to kill anyone, Tracy.
I'll
For fuck's
try.
sake.
The Time Is Now, a Millennium podcast.
But my whole world fell apart. And all they could do, the whole universe, was to silently move on. A quote from author and poet Khadija Rupa. There's one thing about trauma that's especially cruel. It's not the physical and psychological scars you'll have to carry with you your entire life. And it's not the friendships or relationships that may end because of the emotional ramifications as a result of it. It's that life goes on.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast and X-Files podcast was created by Tony Black and is produced and hosted by Carl Sweeney, Sarah Blair and Kurt North.
You can find the podcast on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, and in our group, X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group, and on Instagram at the Xcast pod.
Don't forget, you can support the show by becoming a member on Patreon. Our patrons get early access to episodes, behind-the-scenes chats with our hosts and a thriving community of X-Files, and other premium interviews and specials. To find out more and subscribe, you can go to patreon.com/thexcast. That's patreon.com/thexcast.
We are also part of the We Made This podcast network, full of popular culture shows, including our Millennium series, The Time Is Now. You can find all of our shows at our website, wemadethispod.com, or via Twitter at wemadethispod.
Thanks for listening and keep watching the skies.